A very warm welcome to my channel, War Chronicle. This is the place where we talk about all things warfare, from ancient battles to modern-day conflicts. Today we are going to be talking about the First Chechen War, also known as the Russian-S Vietnam. This conflict was one of Russia's most costly wars after the Great Patriotic War. It was one of the first major conflicts after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and showed the world that Russia was still a major player on the world stage. The war began in late 1994 when the federal government of Russia sent troops into the Chechen Republic of East Korea to end an ongoing rebellion against federal rule led by the charismatic field commander Daka Umarov. The Russian military intervention soon degenerated into a counterinsurgency campaign, with the federal forces being unable to achieve any success against the irregular Chechen forces. Over time, the Chechen campaign turned into a full-scale war, with both sides committing regular army formations and heavy equipment. The war had several phases. In the first phase, which lasted from December 1994 to February 1995, the Russians tried to capture Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. They failed. In the second phase, which lasted from March to August 1995, the Russians attempted to lay siege to Grozny. Again, they failed. In the third phase, which lasted from September 1995 to January 1996, the Russians finally succeeded in capturing Grozny. But the war was far from over. From January to June 1996, there was a fourth phase where both sides fought each other to a standstill. The war ended with the signing of the Kosovo ceasefire. On August 31, 1996, the war was one of the most costly conflicts in post-Soviet Russian history, with over 100,000 casualties. The war also had a profound impact on the course of Russian history. It marked the end of the post-Soviet era of Russian history and the beginning of the Putin era. Let's now look at the events leading up to the war. The Chechen Republic of East Korea is located in the North Caucasus region of Russia. It is a predominantly Muslim republic with a strong sense of ethnic and cultural identity. During the Soviet era, the Chechens were repressed and their national identity was suppressed. However, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Chechens declared independence and established the Chechen Republic of East Korea. The new Chechen state was not recognized by the Russian Federation government, and this led to a number of border disputes between the two entities. In addition, the Chechens were involved in a number of illicit activities such as drug trafficking and illegal arms trading. The Russian government saw the Chechen Republic as a threat to its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and it decided to take action. In October 1993, Russian President Boris Yeltsin met with the leaders of the 7 Northern Caucasus republics, including Chechnya, to discuss ways of resolving the border disputes and bringing the Chechens into the Russian Federation. However, the meeting was unsuccessful, and the Chechens rejected the Russian proposals. On November, the Russian government declared the Chechen Republic of East Korea an extremist and separatist state, and it began to mobilize its forces for a military intervention. On December, Russian troops crossed into Chechnya and began to advance on Grozny. The war was on. The Russian military intervention force consisted of 3 main components: the 40th Army, the 47th Motorized Rifle Division, and the 131st Motorized Rifle Brigade. These units were equipped with a mix of Soviet-era and NATO standard equipment. The war was part of the larger effort to bring the Chechen Republic of East Korea into the Russian Federation. The Russian military intervention force was supported by the Russian Airborne Forces and Special Forces units. The Russian intervention force was under the command of General Vasily Sparsakov. The Chechen irregular forces were led by the charismatic field commander Daka Umarov. Umarov was a former KGB agent who had fought in Afghanistan and had extensive experience in guerrilla warfare. He had been involved in the ongoing rebellion against the federal government, and he was seen as a threat to Russian security. The war began with the Russian military intervention in Chechnya. On December 11, 1994, the intervention force consisted of 35,000 troops. The Russian troops advanced on Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. The fighting was intense, and the Chechen irregular forces put up a fierce resistance. The Russian troops were not able to make any significant progress, and they were forced to dig in and defend themselves. In January 1995, The Russian government declared martial law in the Chechen Republic of East Korea, and it began to mobilize more troops to the region. The situation was becoming increasingly chaotic, and the Russian military was taking heavy casualties. The Russian president was getting nervous, and he began to question the military's ability to conduct the war. On February 3, 1995, the Russian government replaced General Barsukov with General Lebed. Lebed was a hardline general who was not afraid to use force. Lebed began to implement a new strategy that involved using more firepower to try to break the Chechen resistance. Under his leadership, the Russian military began to deploy more tanks and artillery to the front lines. The Chechen irregular forces were still able to hold off the Russian troops, and they continued to inflict heavy casualties on the Russians. On March 6, 1995, the Russian government launched a new offensive to capture Grozny. The offensive involved the deployment of 60,000 troops, 180 tanks, and 200 artillery pieces. The Russian troops advanced on Grozny from three sides. The Chechen irregular forces put up a fierce resistance, but they were eventually forced to retreat. By April 1995, the Russian troops had surrounded Grozny, and the Chechen irregular forces were forced to withdraw into the city. The Russian troops entered Grozny on April 15, 1995, and they captured the city after a month of fighting. The Chechen irregular forces had inflicted heavy casualties on the Russian troops, and they had demonstrated that they could not be defeated in a conventional battle. The war then entered a stalemate, and the Russian troops were unable to make any further progress. The fighting continued, and the Russian troops suffered heavy casualties. On August 31, 1996, the war ended with the signing of the Hasavert ceasefire. The ceasefire was brokered by the leader of the neighboring Dagestan Republic of Makhachkala. The terms of the ceasefire included the withdrawal of Russian troops from Chechnya, the release of all prisoners of war, and the restoration of peace and stability in the region. So why did the Russians fail to defeat the Chechens? There are a number of reasons for the Russian failure. First, the Chechens were fighting on their home turf, and they knew the terrain. They were also able to use the mountainous terrain to their advantage, and the Russian troops were unable to maneuver effectively. Second, the Chechens were led by charismatic field commanders, who were able to inspire their troops to fight. The Chechens were also able to use hit-and-run tactics to inflict casualties on the Russian troops. Third, the Russian troops were not able to effectively coordinate their air and ground operations. The Russian Air Force was not able to provide close air support to the ground troops, and this resulted in heavy casualties. Fourth, the Russian troops were not prepared for urban warfare, and they were icily ambushed in the streets of Grozny. Finally, the Russian government was not fully committed to the war effort, and this led to a lack of resources and supplies for the Russian troops. So what were the consequences of the war? First, the war was a major embarrassment for the Russian military. It showed that the Russian military was not as invincible as it had been during the Soviet era. The war also had a profound impact on the course of Russian history. It marked the end of the post-Soviet era of Russian history and the beginning of the Putin era. After the war, Vladimir Putin became the president of Russia, and he began to implement policies that were more authoritarian and less democratic. The war also led to the creation of the North Caucasus Federal District, which is a federal district that includes the Chechen Republic of East Korea and 6 other Muslim republics. The district is intended to ensure stability and security in the region. This concludes my video on the First Chechen War. I hope you found the video informative, and I hope it has given you a better understanding of this important conflict. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe so that this channel may grow. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.